The wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying flakes of snow that bit into exposed skin like tiny knives. Leora pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the cold still crept in, numbing her fingers and toes. Her breath came out in white clouds, and each step crunched softly in the snow. In her arms, she carried her small child, wrapped in a faded blanket that was far too thin for this bitter night. The child whimpered softly, his tiny face pale and lips trembling. Leora pressed her cheek against his head, whispering a comfort. She didn't believe herself. She'd been walking for hours, going from one door to another, knocking, hoping. Each time, the same thing happened. The door would open a crack. A face would appear, then shut again without a word. Sometimes she heard voices behind the doors, whispering about her kind, about the war, about disease. Sometimes they didn't even bother opening. They just let the silence answer her plea. The snow thickened, and the street grew quieter as the night deepened. The lights from the houses glowed warm behind the frosted windows. But none of that warmth was meant for her. She remembered the last village she had been in, where a woman had given her a crust of bread but told her never to return. Humans and aliens lived in the same region now, but trust was still fragile. And for a widow like her with no home, no family, no allies, it was nearly impossible to survive. Her own people had turned her away because she had once loved a human. The humans here turned her away because she was not one of them. It was as if she belonged nowhere, caught between two worlds, unwanted in both. The child in her arms coughed, a weak, dry sound that made her heart clench. She stopped under a flickering street lamp, pressing the boy closer, trying to shield him from the cold wind. Her toes ached inside her worn boots, and she knew frostbite would come soon if she didn't find shelter. The smell of wood smoke reached her nose, making her stomach twist with hunger. She hadn't eaten since morning, and even then it was only a handful of stale crumbs. The child hadn't had more than a few sips of water. A group of human men passed on the other side of the street, laughing loudly. One of them glanced at her and smirked, whispering something. That made the others laugh harder. Cold night to be walking, alien. One of them called out mockingly. She kept her head down and kept walking, not responding. It was safer to be invisible. They lost interest quickly and turned down another street, their voices fading. Her legs felt heavy, as if the snow itself was holding her back. She spotted another house with light glowing in the windows and decided to try again. She knocked, gently at first, then harder when no one came. The door opened just a few inches, revealing an older woman with a lined face. The woman's eyes scanned her from head to toe, pausing on the child. Then she shook her head slowly and closed the door without a word. Leora stood there for a moment, staring at the wooden door, then turned away. Her throat felt tight, but she forced the tears back. Crying would only waste energy and freeze her face faster. She turned down a smaller, darker street, unsure where it led. The snow here was untouched, her footprints the first to mark it. Her breath grew shallow, her vision slightly blurred from exhaustion. The child's breathing was slow and uneven, and fear gripped her heart. If she couldn't find shelter soon, he might not make it till morning. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Do you need warmth?" it asked, calm but firm. Leora froze, her heartbeat quickening. The voice had come from behind her. Deep and human, she slowly turned. Pulling her child closer, a man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat dusted with snow. His face was partly shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see a pair of steady eyes watching her. There was no mockery in his tone, no disgust in his expression, just curiosity and something else she couldn't place. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He took a step closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "You're not fine," he said quietly, "and neither is the child." Her grip on the boy tightened. She had heard kind voices before, only to learn they hid cruel intentions. Trust was dangerous. It could get her killed, but so could another hour in this cold. The man glanced at the boy then, reached into his coat. For a moment, her muscles tensed, ready to run. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a thick wool coat and held it out to her. "Take it," he said. "At least for the night." The warmth radiating from the coat was almost painful to imagine. Still, she hesitated, unsure if accepting it would trap her somehow. The man didn't push her. He just stood there in the falling snow, holding the coat, his breath visible in the cold air. Finally, the child whimpered again, and Leora's resolve broke. She stepped forward and took the coat, wrapping it around her and the boy. The sudden warmth made her knees weaken. "Better," the man said softly. "Now, come on, my place isn't far." Leora stood still, her mind racing. Should she follow him? Was this fate offering a hand, or danger in disguise? The snow swirled around them, and the night seemed to grow colder by the second. She looked at the boy, saw the way his eyes fluttered weakly, and in that moment, she made her choice. She nodded once, silently. The man turned and began walking. His footsteps sure in the snow, Leora followed, each step a mix of fear and fragile hope. The cold streets were still around her, but for the first time in weeks, there was a chance, however small, that warmth was waiting at the end. The snow crunched softly under their feet as they walked, the cold air biting at Leora's cheeks. She kept her eyes on the ground, following the man's boots as they left deep prints in the fresh snow. The boy in her arms was limp with exhaustion, his small hands curled into the blanket. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but her mind was filled with questions. Who was this man, and why was he helping her? What did he want in return? Every step towards his home could be a step into a trap. Yet turning back meant freezing to death. The street grew narrower, with only a few dim lights glowing from shuttered windows. The wind howled less here, blocked by tall wooden fences. Finally, the man stopped in front of a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of the snow, but the windows glowed with a soft golden light. He stepped forward and pushed the door open, standing aside so she could enter. Leora hesitated, her instincts screaming to stay outside. But the warmth that drifted from the doorway was impossible to ignore. She stepped inside slowly, clutching her child tighter. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and something warm, bread or stew. She couldn't tell. A small fire burned in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The furniture was simple, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a few worn books. The man closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind. He took off his coat and hung it on a hook, then turned to her. "My name's Ethan," he said simply, his voice calm but not unfriendly. Leora said nothing, keeping her distance. She had learned that giving her name too soon could make her vulnerable. Ethan glanced at the boy, then walked towards a cabinet, pulling out a folded blanket. "Here," he said, holding it out. "It's warmer than what you have." Her hands hesitated before taking it. She wrapped it around her son, feeling the softness against his skin. The boy let out a small sigh and leaned into her. "You can sit by the fire," Ethan said, motioning to a chair. Leora shook her head and chose a spot on the floor instead, sitting close enough to feel the heat but far enough to keep her back to the wall. Ethan didn't argue. He moved quietly around the small kitchen area, filling a pot with water and setting it over the fire. The flames crackled softly, filling the silence between them. Leora's eyes scanned the room for signs of danger, weapons, locked doors, anything unusual. She spotted a rifle leaning against the far wall, but it was unloaded, near the hearth. A small kettle hissed as steam began to rise. Ethan poured the hot water into a mug and added dried leaves from a jar. He placed it on the table, then brought it over to her. "Drink," he said. "It'll help with the cold." She stared at the mug, wondering if it was safe. Ethan seemed to read her hesitation. "It's just tea," he added quietly. "You can watch me drink some first." He took a sip, then handed it to her again. Her fingers brushed his as she took the mug, and for a moment, she noticed the roughness of his hands. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles. The skin hardened from years of work or fighting. She took a careful sip, feeling the warmth spread through her throat and chest. For the first time in days, her shivering slowed. Ethan didn't ask questions about where she had come from or why she was out in the cold. Instead, he moved to the stove and began slicing bread. The smell made her stomach tighten painfully. When he placed a small plate in front of her with bread and a slice of cheese, she almost refused out of pride, but the boy's eyes lit up at the sight, and she broke the bread in half, giving the larger piece to him. Ethan sat down in the chair across from them, eating his own food slowly. The fire popped, and shadows danced across his face. After a long silence, he spoke. "You don't have to stay long," he said. "Just until the storm passes." His tone was careful, as if he didn't want her to feel trapped. She studied him, trying to decide if he meant it. Kindness was dangerous. It made you hope, and hope made you weak. Yet something in his steady gaze told her he wasn't lying. The boy finished his bread and leaned against her, already half asleep. Ethan stood and motioned towards a small door at the back. "There's a room there," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm." Leora didn't move. "You can lock it from the inside," he added, as if understanding her fear. That made her pause. She slowly stood, carrying her son into the room. It was small. Just a bed with a faded quilt, a cracked window covered with cloth, and a single lantern. But it was warmer than anywhere she had been in weeks. She laid the boy down and pulled the quilt over him. His breathing steadied almost. Immediately, Leora sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint sounds of Ethan moving around outside the room. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to stay here longer than one night, but she pushed the thought away. Safety never lasted, not for someone like her. And yet, as she leaned back against the wall, the warmth of the room sinking into her bones, she couldn't help but wonder about the man who had opened his door when everyone else had closed theirs. Outside, the wind rattled against the house. But inside, the fire's glow made the shadows seem less sharp. Leora closed her eyes, telling herself she would leave at dawn. But somewhere deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. Asterisk. The pale light of dawn filtered weakly through the cloth over the cracked window. Leora woke slowly, her body still sore from days of walking. But the warmth of the quilt made it hard to move. Her son was curled beside her, breathing softly, his cheeks no longer as pale as last night. For a moment, she let herself feel that small relief. But the reality of their situation returned quickly. They were in a stranger's home, and strangers were unpredictable. She sat up quietly, listening for sounds from outside the room. She could hear faint clinks of metal and the low crackle of the fire. The smell of something cooking drifted in. It was rich and warm, making her stomach tighten with hunger. She hesitated before opening the door, stepping softly into the main room. Ethan was at the small stove, stirring a pot with slow, steady movements. The firelight highlighted the lines on his face, making him look older and more tired than she had noticed before. He glanced over when he heard her, nodding in greeting. "Morning," he said simply. Leora replied with a small nod, her eyes scanning the table where a loaf of bread and 2 mugs sat. Ethan motioned to a chair. "Sit, eat," he said. She stayed standing, still keeping a few steps between them. He didn't seem offended, just continued ladling something from the pot into a bowl. When he placed it on the table in front of her, she saw it was a thick stew, vegetables, beans, and a hint of meat. Her son woke and shuffled out, rubbing his eyes. Ethan poured him a smaller bowl, placing it within reach. The boy didn't wait. He began eating with quick, eager bites. Watching him eat made Leora's chest ache. It had been too long since he'd had a proper meal. She sat down at last, taking a cautious spoonful. The warmth spread through her body, chasing away the chill that seemed to live in her bones. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds, the clink of spoons and the soft crackle of the fire. When they finished, Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, looking at her with a steady gaze. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. But I'm guessing you haven't had much safety lately. Leora kept her eyes on the table. There's no safety for someone like me, she replied quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened in her lap. After a moment, she spoke again, her tone flat but carrying the weight of memory. My name is Leora, she said, finally giving him what she had withheld the night before. My mate died in the war, she continued. We were caught between human soldiers and my own people's army. Her eyes grew distant as the memory surfaced. He was human, and they called me a traitor for loving him. Her people had exiled her, branding her as unworthy. The humans saw only her alien face and assumed she was the enemy. In both worlds, she was an outcast. Ethan didn't interrupt, just listened, his expression unreadable. I've been moving from place to place for months, she went on. Everywhere I go, doors close. She gave a bitter laugh. Sometimes literally, her voice softened. When she looked at her son, he doesn't understand why no one wants us. The boy was sitting on the floor now, playing quietly with a small wooden spoon. Ethan's eyes followed hers, lingering on the child. He doesn't need to understand. That, Ethan said, his voice low. Not yet. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. My wife died, he said suddenly, his eyes still on the flames. It was years ago, but it doesn't feel that long. He told her about a storm that had taken her, a flood in the valley where they had lived. One moment they were together, the next she was gone. After that, he stayed away from people as much as possible. It's easier to be alone, he said. You don't lose anyone that way. Leora studied him, recognizing the hollow sound in his voice. It was the same hollow space that lived in her, yet here he was, letting her into his home, risking trouble with the settlement. You didn't have to let us in, she said finally. Ethan shrugged. Didn't seem right to leave you in the cold. It was said simply, without pride, as if kindness didn't need explanation. Her eyes dropped to his hands again. Seeing the rough scars, she wondered if they were from the war or from years of work. She wondered how many battles, physical or otherwise, he had fought alone. Something in her chest shifted, a feeling she didn't want to name yet. She wasn't ready for trust, but the wall she kept between herself and others felt thinner than before. The day passed slowly. With the snow still falling outside, Ethan went about small chores, chopping wood, checking the roof, feeding the fire. Leora helped in quiet ways, washing the dishes, folding blankets. It felt strange to be doing ordinary things. Each time she glanced at her son, she saw him playing without fear. The deep lines of worry on his small face seemed to fade just a little. That night, Ethan made a small bed for the boy near the fire. It'll be warmer here, he said, and the child settled in quickly. Leora sat nearby, watching the flames. Ethan sat across from her, and for a while, they shared a silence that didn't feel heavy. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the room felt almost like a safe place, almost before sleeping. Leora whispered to herself, just for tonight, but she already knew that part of her was hoping for more. Asterisk. The snowstorm finally eased by the third night, leaving the world outside coated in a thick, white silence. Leora stood by the window, peeking through the cloth that covered the cracked glass. The moonlight reflected off the snow, making the darkness seem brighter but no less cold. Her son was asleep near the fire. Curled up under two blankets, Ethan was outside, chopping wood in the dim light of a lantern. She had offered to help, but he told her to stay inside where it was warm. As she watched, she saw his shadow move steadily in the snow, the axe rising and falling. The rhythm was almost calming, until another shadow appeared at the edge of the yard. It was faint at first, just a shape among the trees. Leora froze, narrowing her eyes. There, movement, quick and deliberate. She stepped back from the window, her heart beating faster. The memory of being followed in other towns came rushing back. She didn't want to believe it, but her instincts whispered danger. Ethan returned a few minutes later, bringing in the wood and shaking the snow from his coat. "You all right?" he asked when he saw her pale face. "I thought I saw someone," she said softly, glancing toward the window. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't look surprised. "They've been watching for days," he said, his tone lower. Breath caught. "Who?" "The men from the settlement," he replied. "They don't like strangers, especially your kind." She sat down slowly, the warmth from the fire suddenly feeling less safe. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Ethan set the wood down, his voice calm but firm. "Because I didn't want you to panic." He poured himself a cup of tea and took a slow sip before continuing. "They've been sniffing around since the night you arrived, waiting for me to make a mistake." Leora's hands tightened on her knees. "What will they do if they find me?" Ethan's gaze was steady. "They'll try to make me hand you over." The thought made her stomach twist. She had been handed over before, treated like she was nothing. Her fingers touched the small scar on her arm, a reminder of one such night. "Will you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan didn't answer right away. He set his cup down, walked to the rifle leaning against the wall, and checked it. Then he looked at her directly. "No," he said simply. "I won't." The way he said it without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, sent a strange warmth through her chest. But there was fear too. If he refused them, they could turn violent. She glanced at her son sleeping peacefully and felt a knot form in her throat. Later that night, she woke to faint voices outside. She slipped from her bed and moved quietly to the window. 3 figures stood near the fence, their breath visible in the cold air. One of them pointed toward the house. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. "Alien. Danger. Get rid of her." The sound of snow crunching behind her made her spin. Ethan was standing there, holding his coat. "They're testing how far they can push," he said quietly. "I'll deal with it." Before she could speak, he stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the window, she saw him approach the men. There was no shouting, no waving of arms, just a low, tense conversation. One of the men gestured toward the house, his face twisted in anger. Ethan shook his head, his body rigid but calm. After a few minutes, the men turned and left, disappearing into the trees. When Ethan came back inside, he brushed snow from his shoulders and set the rifle down by the door. "They won't stop," he said. "But they won't come closer tonight." Leora's chest tightened. "You're risking yourself for me." Ethan shrugged. "It's my choice." She wanted to say more but didn't know how. Instead, she poured him a cup of tea and slid it across the table. He accepted it without a word, and they sat in silence, listening to the wind against the walls. The next day, the sky was clearer, but the air was sharper and colder. Ethan went about his usual chores. Though his eyes often scanned the tree line, Leora stayed inside, helping with small tasks and keeping her son close. Every time she caught a flicker of movement outside, her pulse quickened. She realized that danger was no longer just her burden. Ethan had taken some of it onto himself. That night, as the fire burned low, Leora sat watching the embers. Her son slept soundly, and Ethan sat across from her, mending a tear in his coat. She studied his face in the firelight, the quiet strength in his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. He had given her shelter when no one else would, and now he stood between her and those who wanted her gone. For the first time in years, she felt the fragile stirrings of something she had almost forgotten: trust. Outside, the snow-covered world seemed calm, but she knew the shadows would return. Only now she wasn't facing them alone. The storm returned the next day, fiercer than before. Snow fell in thick sheets, slamming against the windows and burying the world outside in white. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the wooden walls of the house. Leora stood near the fire, holding her son close, feeling the warmth fade each time the wind pushed through the cracks. Ethan was at the table, checking the food supplies, His frown deepened as he counted, then recounted. "We've got maybe 3 days worth left," he said quietly. Leora's stomach sank. 3 days, and the storm outside didn't look like it would end soon. She glanced at her son, who was playing with the spoon Ethan had carved for him. She couldn't let him go hungry again. "I can eat less," she said quickly. "Give him more." Ethan shook his head. "We'll manage, but I might have to make a trip to town." The thought made her tense. "You can't," she said. "Those men," Ethan cut her off gently. "If I don't, we'll run out." He said it like a simple fact. Not a choice. Leora's chest tightened. "They could hurt you." He gave her a faint smile. "I've been hurt before." The hours passed slowly, the house creaking under the weight of the wind. They burned through more firewood than usual. Ethan chopped some inside. The thud of the axe echoing in the small space. Leora cooked what they had, thin stew with more water than vegetables. They ate quietly, each pretending not to notice how small the portions were. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound from outside, the scrape of branches, the groan of wood, made her think of danger. She sat near the fire, watching the embers glow red. Ethan was awake too, sitting in the shadows with his rifle across his knees. "Do you ever regret helping, Emmy?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. He looked at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. "No," he said simply. "Not once." The next morning, the wind had calmed slightly, but the snow was piled high against the door. Ethan cleared it, enough to open a narrow path. "I'll be back by evening," he told her. Pulling on his coat and scarf, Leora moved in front of him, her hands gripping his sleeve. "Please, don't go," she whispered. He shook his head. "I'll be fine." Then softer. "Keep the door locked until I'm back." She watched from the window as he trudged through the deep snow, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared. Into the white, the hours dragged by, the house feeling colder without him. Her son asked when Ethan would be back, and she forced a smile. Soon. But worry gnawed at her every time the wind rose. She imagined him alone in the storm, facing those men from the settlement. By late afternoon, her fear had grown heavier. She paced near the door, glancing out into the snow every few minutes. When the sound of crunching footsteps finally came, she rushed to open the door. Ethan stepped inside, snow clinging to his coat and beard. But there was something else, a dark stain on his glove. Her heart lurched. "You're hurt," he shrugged, as if it were nothing, just a cut. When he removed his glove, she saw the truth. His hand was bruised and bleeding. She grabbed a cloth and pulled him toward the table. "What happened?" she demanded. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "One of them tried to block my way back." Her breath caught. "They attacked you?" "They tried," he said, his tone calm but edged with tiredness. She cleaned the wound, her hands trembling slightly. The thought of him standing alone against men who hated him for helping her made her chest ache. He winced when she tied the cloth around his hand, but didn't pull away. "You shouldn't risk yourself like this," she whispered. His gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "You're worth the risk," he said quietly. The words made her freeze, warmth flooding through her in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. That night they shared the food. He'd brought bread, dried meat, and a few root vegetables. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast compared to what they'd had. Her son laughed for the first time in weeks, and the sound filled the small house like sunlight. Ethan watched him with a faint smile, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. Leora caught herself watching Ethan more than once, noticing the way the firelight softened his face. She told herself it was only gratitude, but deep down, she knew it was becoming something else. Later, when the boy was asleep, Leora sat by the fire, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea. Ethan sat across from her, silent but present. The storm outside had quieted, the snow falling gently now. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The warmth wasn't just from the fire or the food. It was from knowing someone was willing to stand between Her and the cold world, no matter the price, asterisk. The storm passed, but the air outside was sharper than broken glass. The snow had settled into heavy drifts, and the world was silent except for the crunch of boots in the distance. Leora was near the window, peeling vegetables for stew. When she saw them, 5 men walking up the narrow path toward the house, her stomach dropped. She recognized 2 of them from the group that had watched from the fence before. The others were strangers, but their faces were hard, their eyes cold. "Ethan," she called softly, her voice tight. He appeared from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. The moment he saw her expression, he moved to the window. His jaw tightened. "Stay inside, keep the boy close." She stepped toward him. "What will you do?" Ethan didn't answer. He just pulled on his coat and picked up the rifle from beside the door. Her hands clenched. "Please, don't let them take you too." He gave her a quick glance, his eyes steady. "They won't." The knock on the door was more like a hammer blow. Ethan opened it just enough to stand in the frame, blocking the view inside. The man in front, tall, with a scar running down his cheek, spoke first. "You're harboring an alien," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Ethan's tone was calm. "She's no threat to anyone." The man smirked. "That's not what we hear." Another man stepped forward. "You hand her over now, and we'll forget this ever happened." Inside, Leora stood frozen, her son clutching her skirt. She could hear every word through the thin walls. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Ethan's voice carried back to her, steady but firm. "No." There was a pause, then a rough laugh from outside. "Don't be stupid," the scarred man said. "She's not worth your trouble." "She's worth more than any of you will ever understand," Ethan replied. The words made something inside Leora twist, part fear, part something warmer. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like the air had thickened. Then came the sound of boots crunching closer. One of them tried to push past Ethan, but he stepped forward sharply. The rifle in his hands angled low but ready. "I said no," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. From where she stood, Leora could see his shoulders squared, his whole frame like a wall between her and them. A rock suddenly smashed against the side of the house, making her flinch. Her son whimpered, burying his face in her clothes. Another rock hit the window frame, splintering the wood. "Last chance, Ethan," the scarred man growled. Ethan's voice rose slightly. "Go home, before someone gets hurt." For a moment, she thought they might rush him. Her heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. But then one of them muttered something, and the group began to back away slowly. The scarred man's gaze lingered on Ethan, a silent promise of trouble to come, before he turned and followed the others down the path. When Ethan closed the door, the tension seemed to drain from his body. He set the rifle down and exhaled slowly. Leora stood frozen, her hands still clutching her son. "They'll be back," she said, her voice shaking. "Probably," Ethan admitted. "But they'll think twice before coming at night." She stepped closer to him, searching his face. "You stood against all of them. For me." He gave a small shrug. "For you, and for what's right." The words made her chest tighten even more. For so long, she had been treated like a burden, a problem, a curse. Now someone was risking himself without asking for anything in return. That night, the wind picked up again, but the sound outside no longer felt like the only danger. Ethan kept the rifle near the fire, his eyes sharp every time he heard a noise. Leora couldn't sleep, so she sat across from him, watching the way the firelight reflected in his eyes. "You know they might try to hurt you because of me," she said quietly. He didn't look away. "Let them try." The boy stirred in his sleep, and Leora went to cover him with another blanket. When she turned back, Ethan was still watching her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, but something unspoken passed between them, a silent vow. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Asterisk. The days after the confrontation passed with a strange stillness. The snow began to melt slowly under the pale winter sun. revealing patches of frozen earth beneath. The air was still cold, but the heavy storms had ended. Leora noticed fewer shadows at the edge of the property. It seemed the men from the settlement had decided to keep their distance, for now. Still, Ethan kept the rifle near the door, his eyes sharp whenever he went outside. Life inside the small house found a quiet rhythm. In the mornings, Leora helped with cooking and cleaning. Her son laughed more now, running around the room chasing the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window. Ethan repaired a broken fence post in the yard, and Leora brought him water. They spoke more these days, not just about danger or survival, but about small things, stories from their past. Jokes about the stubborn kettle that always whistled too early. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt heavy, but warm. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Leora tensed instantly, her hands tightening on the table. Ethan opened the door to find a woman from the settlement standing there, holding a small basket. She looked uneasy but managed a polite nod. "I heard you might need some vegetables," she said. Glancing at Leora briefly, Ethan took the basket with a quiet, "Thank you." The woman didn't stay, but her visit was enough to make Leora blink in surprise. Maybe not everyone in the settlement wanted her gone. Over the next week, more small gestures came. A jar of dried herbs left on the porch, extra firewood stacked by the gate. No one spoke openly, but Leora began to sense a shift. People were watching, yes, but not always with hostility now. Some seemed curious, others cautious, but the sharp edge of hatred had dulled a little. One morning, Ethan invited her to walk with him into the village. Her first reaction was fear. "I can't," she said quickly. "They'll throw me out." Ethan's eyes were calm. "Not if I'm with you." Reluctantly, she agreed. They walked side by side down the snowy path, her son skipping ahead. Heads turned as they entered the main street. Some villagers muttered under their breath, but no one stepped forward to challenge them. A few even nodded at Ethan, their gazes lingering on the boy laughing in the snow at the small market stall. Ethan traded some firewood for flour and dried meat. Leora stood beside him, feeling dozens of eyes on her. Her chest was tight, but when she looked down at her son smiling, she kept her chin up. They left the market without trouble, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That night, as the three of them sat by the fire eating a proper meal for the first time in weeks, Leora felt something she hadn't in years. Safety. The fear wasn't gone, but it no longer ruled her every thought. Her son's laughter filled the room, and Ethan's quiet smile made her feel seen, not as a burden, not as an alien, but as a person. Later, when the boy had fallen asleep, Leora sat across from Ethan, the fire casting warm light on his face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You don't have to," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "You gave me warmth," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "but you also gave me something I thought I'd never have again." Ethan tilted his head. "What's that?" "A home," she whispered. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just watched her. Then he smiled faintly. "A home isn't walls, Leora. It's the people you keep inside." The words settled in her heart like embers in a hearth, steady and glowing. She looked toward her sleeping son and felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time in years, she believed that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. The winter passed into spring. The snow melted away, revealing green shoots pushing through the soil. Leora helped plant vegetables in the small garden, and her son chased insects along the fence. Neighbors began to greet them openly, and some even stopped to talk. Ethan never made a big deal about it, but she knew it mattered, not just for her, but for him too. They had built something together, something worth keeping. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold over the hills, Ethan stood beside her on the porch. The boy was inside, humming to himself as he drew with a stub of charcoal. "You ever think about leaving?" Ethan asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, not anymore." "Good," he said, and there was a warmth in his tone that made her chest tighten. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the light fade and the first stars appear. The world outside was still uncertain, still capable of cruelty, but within these walls she had warmth, safety, and something even rarer, belonging. And for Leora, that was worth more than anything the cold streets had ever offered.